Show. I'm your host, Erica from Crypto Soul. Through the Erica Show, we connect with talented, passionate builders in the crypto space. And today we have a very special guest. 안녕하세요. 저는 크립토 서울 에리카입니다. 에리카쇼는 유명한 대표들과 함께 소통하는 기회를 만들기 위해 제공된 쇼이고요. 이번 에피소드는 카르다노, 말이 필요 없죠? 카르다노 A다의 대표님 찰스 호스킨슨님을 모셨습니다. Today's guest, I don't really need to explain a lot, but it's Charles Hoskinson, CEO of IOHK, which is building Cardano. Welcome, Charles. Hello, hello.
Erica, it's so good to be on the show.
Welcome, welcome. It's been so long since we last met, and how have you been?
Well, the whole world shut down, and I'm really glad I own a farm. I got donkeys and horses and chickens and lots of land, and so I haven't really felt the quarantine too much, and I don't have to travel anymore, so I've become
it's good for you.
Great. I've been growing my own food. I eat vegetables every day, and they come straight from the garden, and eat my own eggs for my chickens. It's been a really nice change. I used to travel about 250 days a year. I went to 52 countries in the last 5 years, and I haven't been anywhere this year. It's been great.
Yeah, you must be healthy and vibrant and all this organic food, right? It must be.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I'm still fat and old.
And you were in this fasting, right? I saw last time. How was that process?
Oh, I do fast about every quarter. So every 3 months I fast for about a week for health reasons. And what I mean by that is I don't eat any food at all. I just drink water. So I start on a Sunday and I don't eat until the next Sunday. And
what? You okay?
Yeah, whole week, no food. It's great. You lose about 2-3 pounds of fat and a lot of water weight. And about a pound of muscle. You drink some protein shakes and exercise. Next week, you get the pound of muscle right back, but the fat stays off.
Wow, that's intense. That's not easy. Wow, that's amazing. And you have many events on your farm. You had a fire next to your farm, was it? I saw that as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, I live in Boulder County, a little city called Longmont, just outside of Boulder, and we have had just terrible wildfires this year in Colorado. 4 million acres have been burned. And so probably about 30, 40 miles away from the farm, it seems like quite far, but fires can move very quickly.
Sure.
Boulder's foothills caught on fire, and a lot of homes were destroyed. But lucky for me, I'm far enough away from the mountains and the tree line that we didn't have to worry too much.
Oh, it's kind of like California, what's happening in California as well. I think, oh, wow, that's pretty serious.
I was in Lake Tahoe not too long ago, and it was raining ash. It was unbelievable.
I love Lake Tahoe, and I'd be so devastated to see that, I miss the U.S., but then again, this year's been so bad for all countries, especially the U.S. in many ways, right?
Stay away for a few years. We got something going on right now. I assure you, it's not a good time to visit, but we'll fix it. We'll fix it later.
Oh gosh, I visited the U.S. Just before COVID hit, which was January. And I was I'm going to go this year again. I'm destined to go to New York and so forth. And it just suddenly stopped. And this year's been a total craze. Yeah.
You're a Stanford alum, right?
I am, yeah. So I miss campus. I miss that entire area. And yeah, so I go every year, at least once a year. But yeah, I don't think it's going to happen next year. I want to make it next year, but I'm not really sure. We'll see. It's devastating, but the crypto space is doing quite well. I think to turn the atmosphere is really vibrant right now, and DeFi space is blowing up, and all these layer ones are doing awesome, and yeah, it's been exciting times for the industry, which is great. I think. Would you agree or disagree?
Well, it's been a very interesting time in the industry. You have your winners and your losers. BitMEX, for example, is certainly in the column. And there's a lot of winners, especially in the DeFi space. And we go through our booms and our busts, and it looks like Bitcoin is recovering quite nicely, and it tends to drag the altcoins with it. Overall, though, we have just seen year by year growth and adoption of the entire industry as a whole. So if you actually compare 2017 to 2020. We have twice as many users across the spectrum, far more Google searches, far more businesses, far more venture capital, a lot more use and utility than we had before, and more Fortune 500 adoption. And so by every reasonable metric, the industry is quite healthy. And that's nice because I'm in the industry. I like that we're growing and things look good. It's better than the alternative, but there's still some scams and there's still unrealistic expectations, especially when you look at DeFi, where things that really ought not to be valued as high are valued very high. And then, of course, they're in a bubble state and they're going to pop. On the other hand, like certain things and non-cryptos seem to be growing through the sky too, like Tesla, for example. So maybe we live in a kind of a new economy where things just work differently.
Definitely. It's exciting times. I think it's a big transition and, I'm glad to be a part of it in any way, right? And living it through the ages. So I think it's cool. It's a little crazy, but pretty cool. And you've been through the entire crypto histories. I should say, I think you were one of the crypto OGs that people, refer to. And we connected a little later when I entered the industry, but then, the entire history. And I think a lot of people who are out of the industry, who are not yet in the industry, are curious, about the entire story and what you've gone through and so forth. So a lot of things to cover. And I actually got the questions from the Korean community before the interview. And they still had a lot of questions. You've been in Korea and you did a meetup a while back, but people still are curious about you, and which is great. Positive questions, good questions. But let's get straight to it. But before we go, just give a casual intro about yourself. That'd be great. What you work on, just casual, simple.
I started originally in the academic world. I wanted to be a mathematician, and so I spent quite a bit of time thinking about that, trying to plan out what a career in mathematics would look like. And as a mathematician, you can always have these opportunities to go into industry. And so as I said, do I want to be an industrial guy? Do I want to be a professor? And these things. At the same time, I was starting to get politically involved in things like the Ron Paul campaign and things like Austrian economics. I joined the Ludwig von Mises organization. I did all that stuff. And then Bitcoin came around, and I said, wow, this is kind of a roll-up of many of the things I'm interested in. There's this rigorous academic side to it, cryptography and math and software. But then there's political philosophy and monetary policy and open source software and all these other things. I said, wow, this is really unique. So I said, I don't think it's going to work, because at the time, all these things had failed. And if you look at the history of digital currencies, it goes back to the 1980s, and there's tons of failed companies there. So I said, all right, I'll just buy a lot of Bitcoins, mine them, and we'll see what happens there. And around 2013, I decided to professionally enter the industry. And I didn't know anybody at the time, so I said, well, what should I do? So I called up an old professor of mine. His name was Carl Gustafsson. I said, Carl, what should I do? He said, Charles, those who cannot do, teach. I said, oh, that's great advice. So I'm going to teach people about Bitcoin. That's what I'll do. So I created a class called Bitcoin, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto, on a platform called Udemy. And I ended up getting about 70,000 students. And wow. I got over 5,000 emails. And I got a chance through that to know everybody in the industry. I met Roger Ver and Andreas Antonopoulos and all these other people. At the time, they weren't quite so big. No one really cared about them, so you could actually email them. They'd email you back. The egos were still quite low. And of course, they were the OGs to me. And, but I've been now in the space for so long, I guess I've become one too. So anyway, from that course, I ended up being able to raise some money, and I started a company called Invictus Innovations, and I was really interested in stable coins. So I created a product called BitShares with, of all people, Dan Larimer. Dan and I, we didn't get along so well, so I took a buyout. And I said, I'm just going to go do something else. And then I met Vitalik and Anthony and the rest of the gang. And what most people know me from is I was one of the founders of Ethereum. And I helped design the business side and the ICO and a lot of the principles behind how they got it bootstrapped. But they decided to go in kind of more of a not-for-profit oriented way instead of like a Ripple for-profit oriented way. So the business side kind of got liquidated. Amir and I left at the same time, and then Anthony and Joe and others left a little later. Joe created Consensus, and Anthony created his own company called Decentral, and created a whole bunch of products with that. And then I had to kind of make a decision. Do I stay in this space? I'm 0-2. or do I go back to math or something? So I decided to eventually create one more company, and that was Input Output. And really what I wanted to do there was marry kind of two things at the same time. One, I wanted to have a company that had a very strong philosophy about how to build products. And I said, okay, these products are born of the scientific method and of evidence, and we need to follow formal methods and evidence-based software, and we need to follow a rigorous academic approach to protocol development. So that meant I had to hire scientists and set up labs in universities like Tokyo Tech and these other things, and somehow make the peer review process and the formal methods process agile, because it's very waterfall-like and it takes huge amounts of time. So that was one thing. The other thing is the types of products I wanted to build. What I really believe in is this philosophy of cascading disruption. So basically what that means is that you're like the first domino. You're like the little pebble on the top of the hill that when you push it creates an avalanche. So the idea is that you build a product, you embed in it all these processes and rules, and then after a while, maybe a few years, you can actually walk away and the product becomes self-evolving. Bitcoin is like this. The founder, Satoshi, created it, did some stuff to it, left, and Bitcoin's much bigger, much more powerful than when he was there. Mm-hmm. So I said, can we build products like that in many different fields? Like, for example, with Cardano, it's about economic identity and financial inclusion. Okay, that's one dimension. We have other products that we're building that focus on things like privacy. We have products that we build focus on voting and governance. And each of these domains, we always ask, how do we be that first domino or that first mover? And what do we need to do to actually build a self-sustaining, self-evolving system? And we build those systems with principles, namely evidence-based software and scientific method. So I thought this was crazy. I figured I'd be out of business in a year or two. I started the company in 2015, and we grew like a weed. We went from 2 people to well over 250 people now. We're in 40 countries, and we do business all across the globe, a lot in Africa, a lot in Eastern Europe, some in Mongolia, of all places. I didn't know there was such a strong Mongolia-Korea connection, by the way, until I started.
There is.
Actually, a lot of Mongolians go to Korea for education because it has such great universities. But it's been a lot of fun to kind of travel the world and meet the people of the world. And what we really get to do is solve problems. So we have older people come to us and say, how do we avoid fertilizer being stolen, or clean up our air quality, or improve our voting system, or run a lot of fraud in property registration? And we get to look at that and build a blockchain-based solution, which is open and inclusive. So it's been an amazing experience these last 8 years, and I'm glad I took the leap.
Yeah. Wow, what a history. I mean, it's been a long story, and you just explained everything, I think. I mean, you basically hit the important, I think, projects like Ethereum, BitShares, like everything that I kind of heard from on the bystand. I was like, oh, you know, this is like the history, and now you become the history.
I've gotten pretty good at telling it.
I know, you're such a great speaker. So I'm always awed at how you speak, because like you're a teacher too, so you know how to explain in simple terms. I think that's great for such a complicated concept, because I mean, Cardano is not a simple project. It's definitely not. It's very academic, and there's many, I think, mathematics and all these like science. Some things that I cannot really understand, to be honest, but like they're involved. But you explain it very in a simplistic way, which is great. And I think the community needs that as well, because it's very difficult to understand every concept. But with that in mind, could you simply, in simplistic terms, explain what you're trying to build? And I mean, there are many, many models, but Ouroboros and
it's not too hard to explain it. It's hard to build it, and that's the way it ought to be. There's an old saying: if you can't explain it, people won't demand it. So you have to really break it down into its root components. So to understand Cardano, you really have to understand where we came from as an industry. And then once you understand that context, everything kind of fits together. So where did we come from? We came from Bitcoin. We call that a first generation cryptocurrency. And in that case, Bitcoin was all about saying, hey, we have this crazy idea that we're going to have this token, and somehow people are actually going to buy it for real money. And because it has value, it's going to attract all these people from around the world to mine it. And then eventually it'll get so popular that like dedicated businesses will form around it, like exchanges and ASIC manufacturers and so forth. That was a pretty crazy idea. And that alone was worth an experiment. So in 2009 to about 2013, that was the experimental phase of Bitcoin. And then in 2013, Bitcoin got to about $1 billion, a stable industry formed around it. And I said, all right, well, it's not going anywhere. Bitcoin is here to stay. The problem with Bitcoin, though, is it's blind, deaf, and dumb. And what I mean by that is that you can't do much with it other than just push Bitcoins around. You can't issue your own currency. You can't write applications. It's almost like the web browser before JavaScript. You had the DOM in the web browsers. You had these static websites, and you could make them pretty, but you couldn't make the websites interactive. So you couldn't get Facebook and Google and MySpace and Amazon and all these things or YouTube that we take for granted today. So what changed everything? People said, oh, well, let's add a programming language to manipulate the DOM to the web browsers. That was JavaScript. The minute that JavaScript came to the browser, then you could have Facebook and Amazon and MySpace and these other things. Well, analogously, the second generation cryptocurrencies was Ethereum. And what that was all about is saying, okay, we'll keep the blockchain, we'll keep the mining, we'll keep all this infrastructure. That's all fine and great. But we're going to add a programming language to the blockchain, and that's usable. Suddenly, as soon as they did that, then all these people started writing applications. You got DeFi, the ICO revolution. You got all this cool stuff. Now we have the Uniswaps and the MakerDAOs and the Golems, all these things that are really heating up the industry. So back in 2015, what we did is we took a step back and we asked a very simple question, which was, what is the consequence of Ethereum's success? If it works, what's going to happen to the industry? Similarly, in 2013, we kind of said, okay, well, what is the consequence of Bitcoin's success? You need something like Ethereum to make it useful. We identified that there were 3 problems that were going to come up if Ethereum was successful. The first was scalability. The problem with the way that Bitcoin and Ethereum are designed today, and Vitalik is the first to admit this because he's building F2, is that Ethereum can only get to a certain level of usage. And at that point, it becomes untenable. The transactions get too expensive, the system bloats too much. So you need a fundamentally different protocol stack that as you gain users, your performance level stays about the same. We kind of take this for granted with Facebook and YouTube and these other big services, but they actually have to put a lot of money and effort into creating systems that can work for millions to billions of people. And frankly, protocols are no different. So you really need to think carefully about that. So we said, okay, we need to figure out how to solve that problem. Second, we said, well, there's this interoperability problem where we're not going to live in a world where there are one standard. It's going to be thousands. It's going to be what Korea wants to do and Japan wants to do, and China doesn't get along with anybody, so it's what China wants to do and all these other things, right? And so you need to talk to all those things. You need to be able to move value, people, identity, and users, all these things between these different protocols. So you need interoperability, okay? And then finally, we have this governance problem. We saw this with Bitcoin and with Ethereum, where when you get too big, eventually it gets too hard to make controversial decisions without fracturing your protocol. So for example, Bitcoin got to a certain scale and they said, okay, now let's talk about how to solve it. Oh, big blocks versus SegWit. And this huge fight happened. And then suddenly Bitcoin collapsed in on itself and it split into 2. You had Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. Similarly, we had Ethereum with the DAO hack. Some people said, reimburse the funds. Some people said code is law. It split into Ethereum Classic. This is a big barrier to government adoption, Fortune 500 adoption, and mainstream adoption, because everyday users and corporations, they don't want to be in a situation that every time a controversy happens, there's now 2 tokens, 2 platforms, and Microsoft has to make a decision. Are we a Bitcoin Cash guy or are we a Bitcoin? It's a problem. So you have a governance problem at the root of it. How do you decide how to change the system? And people say, oh, well, you don't need to. You can just build everything up front and live with it. Well, here's the problem. What happens when quantum computers come out? For example, Korea is a world leader. There's some phenomenal researchers in Seoul. And if not Korea, then Japan. If not that, America. If not that, Germany. In the next 10, 20 years, someone's probably going to have a commercializable quantum computer that can break cryptography. That's a foregone conclusion for where we're at. What does this mean? It means that every cryptocurrency is going to have to figure out how to take all its crypto guts, rip them out, and put in post-quantum stuff. Well, who gets to decide that, and which protocol stack do you go with? That's a far more controversial thing than just big blocks versus SegWit. And if Bitcoin can't resolve that at a much smaller scale, how do you resolve that with millions or billions of users inside the system? So we said, hey, this is going to be a big problem. And the other side of it is the who pays side of the problem. We often call this the golden rule, which is he who has the gold makes the rules. So we see, for example, Google has enormous influence over web standards. And they somehow manipulate those standards to, for example, allow them to inject ads into browsers, and who can turn them down because they control Chrome and the Chromium platform, and even Microsoft uses Chromium now. Yeah. So if you're paying for it, you probably have a lot of say in what it's going to look like. So we say these cryptocurrencies are decentralized, but if they don't have an independent source of funding, then you have a situation where a small group of actors can basically decide where they go. Okay, so we said these are our three classes of problems: the scalability, the interoperability, and the sustainability, both who decides and who pays. And we said, all right, well, let's just go be scientists for a little while. So from 2015 to 2017, we took a big step back and we just did academic research and we asked foundational questions. We didn't take a position on anything. We said, what is a blockchain? We didn't even think about proof of work or proof of stake. We just tried to create definitions and models and really try to understand enough foundations so that we could reasonably approach these problems. So even if we didn't solve them, we could be in the right direction. So it was just a matter of iteration for the protocols that we had. So we invented a new proof of stake protocol called Ouroboros. We invented a whole bunch of interoperability protocols like NEPA-PALs and sidechain protocols and so forth. And then we also invented a very rich, deep governance stack. And we did this through a series of more than 75 academic papers cited more than 2,500 times, appearing at most major conferences in the world, everywhere from conferences in Korea to conferences in Shanghai, conferences in Tokyo, in Toronto, and at Harvard, at MIT. We went to California. I became quite acquainted with the Berkeley campus. It was a great experience. Now, once we did the science, then we said, how do we actually build something like this? So then we decided to pick one of the most scientifically oriented programming languages, one called Haskell, which has been around since the 1980s. And we use this with formal methods to very rigorously, with a lot of PhD developers from places like Oxford and other places, really, really, really rigorously implement these things. We wrote over 1 million lines of code. So it was a lot of work, but we managed to actually get Cardano launched to market in September of 2017. It was a release called Byron, and it operated much like Ripple did in a federated network. And the point there was to get on exchanges, get liquidity, introduce the project to the world, get a population. And then what we said is over time, we'll gradually decentralize the system as we turn on the protocols. So this year, much anticipated, in July, we finally launched Shelley, and we were able to go from a static and federated system to a dynamic and decentralized system. And so now we have over 1,200 stateful operators. We're 100 times more decentralized than Bitcoin in that respect. And they're making blocks every day, and the network keeps getting more decentralized every day. And we're just about to turn on the smart contract stack. And at the same time, we've been running a series of governance experiments to solve that who pays and who decides side of things for a project called Catalyst. So we've been really chipping away at this huge agenda. It's almost like a DARPA program. There's been probably more than 12 companies that have worked on it across, as I've mentioned, more than 40 countries, and hundreds of people have touched it throughout the life, if not thousands, of the project. And our community has now grown to hundreds of thousands of people. So it's been an incredible journey in that respect, and it far exceeded my expectations. It was a kind of a humble little experiment. And the point of all of it was that once we get all these things in, we have to do something with it. What I care most about is this idea of economic identity. So why we built the platform is we said, we'd like for people who don't have banking services, don't have financial services in the developing world, places like Ethiopia, places like Uganda, places like Georgia, to actually be able to be their own bank and have their own identity service and be able to get access to insurance and access to credit and be able to send money anywhere in the world. And it shouldn't have to cost them 15% or 30%. And they should be able to get loans at a reasonable interest rate and so forth. So there's over 3 billion people who live in that category. So we kind of built this protocol for them so that when they show up, they'll have a good, reliable, dependable home and predictable cost in that operation. So at the same time, while building all this, I had to go set up infrastructure in all these jurisdictions. So I set up an office in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa, and I sent my poor director of African operations. He lived in London. He was an Oxford graduate. His name's John O'Connor. I said, John, you're going to go live in Ethiopia.
Oh, really?
Okay, that sounds great. So we entered that jurisdiction. I've sent people to Mongolia. I've personally gone there. I've sent people all throughout Africa and Eastern Europe, and we've built great relationships with all the governments there, signed MOUs with them, and we bid on a lot of projects. And all of those projects will bring users and utility into the system over a long period of time.
Oh, it's such a massive project. And coming back to your explanation, Haskell, right? So the Haskell community in Korea is very excited about your project. I think they respect what you're doing, and I think they're anticipating what you're going to bring to the community, because Haskell is such a respected language, right? So yeah, it's great. And also Shelly, and everyone was wondering where does the name come from? And Shelly is like a, it's a name, but like it's very familiar, comfortable name. I don't know. It's like a girl name too. Sometimes I don't know where it comes from, and I know where it comes from, like from you like poems and right. And so, but can you explain like where the name comes from and how has the Shelly upgrade the POS system has been running recently?
So we started launching Shelly last year in December with something called the incentivized testnet. And we used the incentivized testnet to basically start building up a collection of operators, because our protocol is quite complicated to operate. So we needed to train people. And so we said, let's learn how to walk before we run. So we did that in a safe side network. And we built up over 1,000 operators in a 6-month period. Once we were comfortable with that, then we rolled those operators over into the main network and hard forked to the Shelling system. So now those people are actually running small businesses and they make blocks for a living. People delegate to them. And if you download Daedalus, you can see this beautiful delegation center, and everybody has these little tiles and they advertise their services and so forth. And we actually have a surprisingly large amount of female stake pool operators, and some are self-taught, like stay-at-home moms in Wyoming and places like that. It's pretty amazing. So Shelly's been running quite well. Our network quality is well over 98%. Most people are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and the system is quite stable. And so we're going to be doing a series of intermediate upgrades to improve the delegation, to improve the staking experience, and also the operating environment, so that you can have more secure day-to-day operations with your stake pool. So these are iterative improvements, but they're exactly what you expect post-launch. There's a lot of stuff that you would have liked to have done, but you didn't have time to do it, and now we're doing it. The name Shelly is interesting. There's actually 2 famous Shelleys. There's Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley. So a lot of people think it's Mary Shelley because she's the more famous of the 2. She wrote Frankenstein and a lot of other books. And her husband, Percy, was a famous poet. He was also a member of the Illuminati, and he traveled the world and was an artist. He did a lot of really cool things. So actually, I named Shelley after Percy, but at this point, so many people confuse it for Mary. I say, take your pick. But the point of it was that no matter how great a centralized system is, there's this concept that eventually time takes its place. And so Shelley wrote a very famous poem called Ozymandias, which was about a traveler who went to Egypt, and he saw all these ruined monuments from long, long ago. And he was just kind of commenting on the fact that they're all decaying now. And so I kind of looked at it the same way, that all things must change, and no matter how great your original ideas are, time takes its place. So it's kind of a reminder that these systems require constant vigilance and updates and maintenance to be able to actually sustain themselves. And it's now in the hands of not a leader, but the community to do that with Shelley. So I felt that was a proper way of naming it. But then everybody said, oh, well, you're creating a Frankenstein monster into the world. So it must be an allegory of Mary Shelley. Oh, damn it. You guys are taking the name from me. But anyway, it's overwhelmingly well received. It's the best proof of stake protocol around, bar none. Everybody cites our papers. We've solved every major problem, from how to keep a clock, to dealing with adaptive security, to semi-synchrony, to bootstrapping from Genesis. So we know it's great because our competitors cite it. And so that's it's been a fun process.
It's a good sign that if your competitors cite it, and that's great. I mean, Shelley, I never knew it had two names, famous names with that. But yeah, amazing story. I think a lot of people were curious about it. So Cardano project reached the 3rd anniversary, I believe. It's on September 28th. Congratulations. Is that correct?
3rd anniversary since we launched Byron. It's been going on since 2015.
Yeah.
but public, meaning the people are using it, buying it, trading it, and doing stuff with it. It's been third anniversary, and we did the second one in Bulgaria. We planted a bunch of trees
Oh,
in a little city called Plotiv, and one of these days I'll be able to go back 10, 15 years from now and see these big trees. And we did the first anniversary in Tokyo, Japan.
oh, awesome. And this year, did you celebrate? How did you celebrate?
Oh, I didn't go anywhere. It's COVID time, so next year we'll have a
Online.
nice, yeah.
An online celebration, probably.
Of course, I have a big summit this year, the Shelley Summit. We had over 10,000 people attend, including the founder of the internet, Vince Cerf, and
Wow.
Wolfram from Wolfram Research. So it was a great event. We had a lot of fun with it, and that kind of served as a spiritual celebration of Cardano's third anniversary because it happened in July, very close
Right.
to September.
Ah, I see. I mean, the journey has been, as you explained, it's been very, very, I don't know, how should I say, very, it's been amazing, I think. And I mean, I never noticed that you had so many employees. I mean, it's quite amazing. How did you build your employee base? I mean, I think the company has grown so much, and I didn't really, I mean, I didn't see them all at once. I didn't really notice, but I mean, where are they and how how did you grow this big company? I'm
Yeah,
just oh,
you know, I never valued HR until I actually relied upon a good HR department. And then you said, wow, HR is really the key to all of this. And I have primarily one person to thank for building that out. Her name is Tamara Hassan. And
oh,
when she came on board, she was fresh out of law school and she was our culture officer. She was
mm.
working for Don Tapscott and just had helped him write one of his books. And I called her up and I said, that guy's a dummy. You should go work for me. And
Oh my
and she
God.
said, okay, I'll come on board. What do you want me to do? I said, culture is super important in a software company that's decentralized. Let's focus on that. So
Mm.
after she worked for that for a while, she said, culture is important, but you have an HR problem. You need a proper HR department. I said, well, that's a good point. You know how to build one? She said, well, we're going to figure it out. I said, okay. So she spent over 2 years building this absolutely extraordinary HR department and hiring great recruiters and being able to really up our game and our ability to retain talent, incentivize talent, and so forth, building out the basic legal policies and these things. And once you have all those in place, then suddenly you can just grow, absolutely grow. So then she kind of upgraded from our director of HR to become my chief of staff. And so she's kind of like the number two floating around. And I work with her on a pretty much daily basis on everything. And I delegate tons of tasks out her way, and we talk strategy and so forth. So she's a huge contributor, and the people she hired, like Sasha, one of our recruiters, and Glenda, the current HR director, and dozens of others, are really the ones that actually allowed us to scale. But then we also, at the same time, had to build a great product team. So we have
Mm.
people like Danelle Patel and Aparna Jew and a lot of other product managers and business analysts and project managers that live in the product side of the organization. Then we had to build a great operations department that's led by Jer Maroney, and he does a phenomenal job working really hard trying to corral all these people. Then we had to upgrade all of our IT systems, and so we use Slack and Jira, and we had to get a good document management system, so we use a lot of Google products and HelloSign. So there's tons of little things we had to put together to be able to operate efficiently. Then we had to hire a great general counsel. Then we had to hire a great CFO. My CFO is Jeff Pollock, and he comes out of Wall Street. He was the operating officer of Mizuho. So
Mm.
he's been all around the world. And so we just brought this incredible team of people together, and each and every one of them are true professionals, and they know what to do and how to do it. And so, yeah, we're 250 people, but the reality is that we're a smaller collection of great leaders who lead those 250 people, enable the company to be able to operate with those people effectively and efficiently. And you see where people get it wrong. Consensus, for example, they grew from nothing to 1,100 people. They had to downsize to 700 because it was
Yeah.
just so hard being at that scale.
Mm.
And your ability to execute in that company was basically like your proximity to Joe Lubin. If you were close to the Sun King, you could get things done. If you were not graced by his radiance and warmth, your project would probably at some point kind of fragment off and spin out.
Mm.
Here we try to avoid that. We try to actually create great checks and balances and develop leaders at every level and kind of have more horizontal structures and have people really understand what they're doing. And that's a huge challenge. You have to think really hard, like OKRs and all these other things. And there's just a dozen different tools and techniques. And every now and then we'd experiment and add new things. Like just recently, we created an enterprise account for Udemy. So all of our employees can take classes for free on that platform. And
Cool.
We have reading lists and all other things that we do. So there's a lot of different operations that we have to try to keep the company together. But being a distributed company, it is very hard. And one of the crutches that I used as a CEO to lead was traveling. I'd actually go to office after office and meet people in person. So I'd travel to Scotland, and I'd travel to Eastern Europe, and I'd travel to Japan and all these other places. And that worked when we were at a smaller scale. But this year I had to learn how to lead remotely. And I didn't have the ability to, if there was a problem, just go in person and kind of calm everybody down. I had to figure out how are we going to do this over Slack or email or, a Hangout or something like that. And that was a different set of goals. And it's been a tough year, but a very productive year. And I'm just so lucky as a leader to have such great leaders working with me to help me get the company where it needs to go.
Awesome. Distant working is effective but efficient, but at the same time it's very frustrating when it comes to communication. And it's definitely, with a large team like this, it's going to be definitely difficult for you. But it's going really smoothly, and a lot of people were impatient, right? They're impatient, like when Ada, they're like, when Cardano. I think a lot of people were asking that question.
Well, it just depends on how you view it. The problem with our industry is that it's dominated by speculators. And so they wake up every day and they say, why am I not getting phenomenal returns? It's a scam if I don't get a 10x. And I look at it like the Shinkansen in Japan. I say, like, I remember living in Osaka and saying, well, I met people whose grandfathers worked on the train, and they're anticipating their grandchildren to work on that train line. They plan things out till 2050. It's the same in Korea. It's the same in many other countries. There's like these multi-generational projects. We used to do this in Europe. We had cathedrals there that would take 200 years to build. So, a family, like a whole dynasty, would be involved in the construction and piling of a cathedral. Well, we don't tend to do that anymore because of this startup Silicon Valley mentality. But the protocols that we're engineering, if we get them right, will end up guiding our financial world, our identity world, our governance world for perhaps a century or longer. So we have to think really, really carefully about the decisions we make, or else what will end up happening is we get weighed down by poor design decisions. This is really evident, actually, when we had our Shelley Summit this year. We invited Vint Cerf to come, and Vint created the internet. So we asked him, we said, hey, Vint, if you could create TCP/IP over again, what would you have done differently, given that you now have 40 years of experience? And he said, oh, man, I have many, many things to say about that. Because, at the time, the internet was just a collection of computers, mostly military, and they couldn't imagine a concept of 4 million computers together, much less billions of computers. And computers were not mobile. They filled an entire room. This idea that a cell phone was a computer was just a crazy concept. So they never designed the internet for security or for identity built in or mobility built in or any of these other things. Well, the consequences of those poor design decisions was that we've been trying to fix it. And unfortunately, it's led to a lot of centralization. It's led to a lot of inefficiencies. You can't get your Wi-Fi to connect properly. You get hacked all the time. You have to use passwords and usernames on the internet. Whereas if it was designed with foresight, none of these problems would be evident. E-commerce would be a lot safer. Your browsing experience would be a lot better. So we said, well, look, I don't want to have TCP/IP financial systems. I don't want a situation where I can't vote because suddenly, the internet, the voting system is down because somebody poorly designed something because they were rushing to try to be the market winner. The reality is we have the time. People are going to upgrade at their own pace, and these upgrades are going to take decades, ultimately. So this is not a game of how the hell do we get to 1 million users tomorrow, because that's a vanity thing. And yes, your market price will go up in the short term. But if you want to be here to stay and become $1 trillion ecosystem and have millions, if not billions of users and change people's lives, you have to have foresight in the way that you design things, which means you have to involve scientists and engineers and universities in a deliberative, systematic process. The other thing is you have to escape your founders. So part of the scientific method is saying you guys don't have to rely on Charles Hoskinson being the smartest guy in the world Because what if I get hit by a bus? What if I die of a heart attack? I mean, Steve Jobs died. People go away. So, if you say, well, we'll win because Vitalik is brilliant, or we'll win because Dan Larimer is brilliant, that's a fundamental mistake. And what if they get corrupted or co-opted or arrested? Your whole ecosystem falls apart. The point of the scientific method is it's faceless. Your academics can be Korean, they can be African, they can be South American. It doesn't matter. They're all across the world. And you've created a change system that is independent of the people who started the system. So 50 years from now, it's still going to evolve. It's still going to grow. It's still going to have those capabilities. And it's been built on solid foundations. And so it's probably not going to suffer from bad problems. It's going to be very reliable. It's going to be very consistent, just like the trains and these other things that people really thought about these things built. So yeah, we're a little slower in a certain respect, but on the other hand, we've actually started outpacing our competitors. A great example would be the tale of two proof-of-stake protocols, Ouroboros versus Casper. So in the beginning, Vitalik had a 1-year lead on us. He was writing up Casper. F2 is going to ship in 2016, going to ship in 2017, going to ship in 2018, going to ship in 2019. Well, here's what happened. They designed a protocol, and it worked until it didn't. And then they said, oh, God, we have to redesign the whole thing. So they'd redesign it. And then it worked until it didn't. Oh, well, and we have to redesign it. They just kept experiencing that. Meanwhile, we, like the tortoise, we're just slowly but surely publishing after paper, after paper, after paper, and every one of them built on the prior result. So we started in foundational problems, and then we gradually solved the problems of proof of stake. And now we're in a position that not only have we solved all the problems that Vitalik is trying to solve and can't quite get there, but we also know where it goes. We know how to wire in layer 2 protocols. We know how to shard it where and when we want to. We know how to deal with theoretical problems they haven't even considered yet, like timekeeping problems and recovery from 51% attacks and so forth. And we did this with the academic community, 2,500 citations, and now projects like Algorand cite our papers, great teams out of UIUC led by Pramod Viswanath, for example. They created a recent paper called Nakamoto Proof of Stake, all derivative works of things that we've done. So we have academic validation that the ideas are right, and we have industry validation that the ideas are right, and we never regress. We've never had a situation where we had to throw away a protocol and say, oh God, we have to start over the whole thing. No, it's always just been iterative all the way through. So we were a little slower to start, but now we're speeding up, and we have a future. We know exactly where to go and how to get these things to 1 million users and 1 billion users. It'll take time, but we know the road ahead, and we don't have to go and do these dramatic things like this F2 plan and hope to God that the whole thing works. And what's also reassuring is that we were growing up at the same time as 2 other academic proof-of-stake projects. There was out of Cornell, the Snow White project led by Elaine Hsu. And then out of MIT, Silvio Macaulay created Algorand. Yeah. So when we were creating Ouroboros, they were creating their protocols as well. And there was a lot of cross-pollination between these projects in terms of everything from random number generation with the VRF to how the network model should be done and so forth. So as a consequence, that cross-pollination in the academic world from independent teams at great places, Edinburgh, Cornell, and MIT, respectively, gave us a lot of confidence that the collective approaches, even though we were slightly different, in the case of Algorand, very different, are in the same relative mindset. So that means that we all have confidence that these things work and they're actually going to result in viable long-term systems. So, I see people complain, but I think it comes out of a frustration of, well, I want more money. It's a speculative complaint. And I say, well, look, would you rather be early in Microsoft and follow it through its life and end up in a $1.6 trillion ecosystem? Or would you want to be in Lotus? Would you like to be in any of the other 200 software companies that were started in 1975 that didn't survive? Yeah, at one point, Microsoft was one of the smallest of the 200 that were started. How'd that work out? Yeah, they grew. And it's the same for Apple. They went through a lot of struggles. A lot of people thought Apple was going to go out of business in the late 90s. And now look how valuable and powerful Apple is as a company because the foundations were right. And even though it took time for them to get to where they needed to go, they got to iTunes, they got to the iPhone, they got to the iPad, and they defined an entire industry. And that's what you need to do to lead. And I think we're following a very reasonable and measured philosophy with Cardano that will not only avoid the problems of the future, but it will actually make people very comfortable in adopting us, especially governments, because they really need trust in those relationships. Because at the end of the day, they're saying, well, I'm going to put my elections and who gets to be president is going to be decided by this system. Or my money, my nation state money, my central bank issued digital currency is going to be on this system. You can't look at them and say, we built it in 6 months. We hope it works. There's no independent validation of that. Best of luck. They're going to spend 2 years just looking at it before they make that decision. So you have plenty of time to really think about these things and build these things if that's your target and what you want to do.
Yeah, totally. I understand. Thank you for your response. I think it really hits like I think a lot of people were curious about it, and I mean, I think you're slowly moving, but I think it's making progress. So, and no regression. So it's great. And talking about, you just kind of briefly mentioned about the 51% of tax, but the relationship with ETC, right? And recently ETC suffered from many 51% attacks, and it was horrible. I mean, I was, literally, I was like, oh no. But I wonder, like, what's your take on it, and how would Cardano support it, or what's the response to that?
So that's a legacy project. I was a founder of Ethereum. And when we did the ICO, there were actually two distinct philosophies that people were putting money into the ICO for. One philosophy was the philosophy of code is law. So they said, we like Bitcoin, we like that, but we'd like some programmability to it, but we like the ethics of Bitcoin. And then there was another group that was like, hey, we're the world computer, and we want to do dApps and DeFi. And they didn't have as strong of a philosophical viewpoint on immutability. So both of them had put money in. So my view was that both parties should be taken care of. So they were unified until an event occurred to actually push them into their camps. And that was the DAO hack. So when the DAO hack happened, some people went left and some people went right. And it turned out it was about 90-10. About 90% of the population was in the world computer camp. About 10% of the population was in the code is law camp. Okay. So my whole point when that occurred was choice. The Ethereum Foundation should support both sides and let the market decide, and don't take a preference one way or the other. And they could have very easily done that. They chose not to. In fact, they tried to kill the other side. And a lot of people in the Ethereum community mocked and brutally attacked Ethereum Classic in the early days. So I said, look, I was a founder. I was there. It's immoral for me to have been part of this and have one whole group of people get screwed. I feel responsible. So I took it upon myself, as did others, to build up the ETC ecosystem so that choice could be given. So there were already clients working. So what we did is we actually built a completely new one. So we said, before we can propose a roadmap for ETC, we need to demonstrate that we're at the same technical level as the Ethereum Foundation. You don't demonstrate that by forking someone else's code, hiring some developers, and then saying somehow you're brilliant and capable. What you do is you actually build it from scratch in a completely new language to demonstrate you fully understand the design of the system. So we did that. We hired Scala developers. We brought in architects. We formalized the EVM with a partner named Runtime Verification. And we actually wrote a client called Mantis. And it was the first native ETC client, written 100% Scala code. We actually showed it off in Korea, of all places, because they had a summit in Seoul. And that was when it finally got turned on. It took us a year and a half and about $1.5 million to develop Mantis. It was a lot of work. Wow. So after we'd done that, we released it. It was actually when it was released, it worked with both Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. So it was a native client for both systems. Oh. So we could have been an Ethereum core developer at that time, which was kind of a weird experience. They invited us. I was like, well, thanks, Virgil. That's cool. But we went to the ETC community. We said, what do you guys want to do? You have to innovate to survive. Code is law is a philosophy, but why should a dApp developer build something on this platform? You can't just say we're the platform as principles. Bitcoin will eventually get smart contracts as they're getting with Taproot. So when that happens, ETC has no future. So let's innovate. The problem is that innovation costs money. So we said, look, Zcash is doing a really cool thing with a treasury model. Let's institute that type of funding mechanism into ETC. And then there's dedicated funding for independent development teams to go and innovate and build things. The community said, we don't want to do that. We said, okay. So we left. We left in 2017. We said, we're working on Cardano anyway. Even though it was a separate team, best of luck. We open sourced all the code, and anybody wanted to use Mantis, they could. So I didn't think much about ETC at that point because they had people who said they were going to take care of it, ETC Labs and these other people. And then 4 years later, they're basically in the exact same place that I left them in, with the difference that they've lost so much adoption in hash rate that they've now been preyed on by 51% attacks. So I called up Bob Summerwall, and he's part of the ETC leadership. He's part of the ETC cooperative. And I said, Bob, what are you guys going to do about this? And he said, well, you know, we're doing some stuff. I said, okay, but is there a roadmap? Is there a future? Because the reality is the only way ETC can survive is it has to justify its existence. It has to prove that it's worth something. The price has to go up enough that it's not affordable to do a 51% attack. So we decided to do one more time to come back into the ecosystem, resurrect Mantis from where we had it in 2017, and basically propose a treasury system. And come November, we'll have a testnet for it. And in Q1 of next year, we in the cooperative are going to try to push for the community to adopt a treasury. If they don't adopt a treasury, it's my firm belief that ETC will die as a project. If they do adopt a treasury, then the consequence of that is that 3 independent teams will be building 3 independent clients, and we can work together, collaborate together, and we can come up with a beautiful roadmap in 2021 to really realize what code is law means and make it unique and different from Ethereum and unique and different from Cardano and Bitcoin, and actually have the product have a right to exist and deserve to exist. And we've gotten a lot of great support from people like Barry Silbert and others who they're in this ecosystem and they're desperate for a future for the ecosystem because they really want it to get to the next level. About the only team that doesn't quite support us is ETC Labs. They're right now the incumbent. They maintain Geth. They seem to think that the last 4 years have been great, even though they've lost half of their market value, 80% of their hash rate, and they're constantly attacked with 51% attacks. We say, okay, tell us where people are going to get funding. They say from us. We say how. We say, we'll talk to you later. We say, okay, what's your roadmap and vision? Donating money to the United Nations or whatever. So, okay. It makes no sense to me. There's really no innovation there. So we'll see what the community wants to do. And you know, if they don't want to go along with it, then it is what it is. At least we put our money where our mouth was. We spent millions of dollars trying to help them out. We gave people a choice. And of course, as a cryptocurrency, it's independent. So we don't get to decide. The community gets to decide, and we'll see what they do in Q1.
Oh, okay. Wow. Important milestones ahead for Q1.
It's a completely independent team of the Cardano team, by the way. It's a whole Scala team, and they're different developers. And we did that on purpose. We wanted to make sure there was no resource overlap between those 2 projects. So no one from Mantis works on Cardano or vice versa.
I see. Wow, so many stories that I have to take in. And speaking of code of law, actually there is a Korean style Wikipedia, Korean style, called Namu Wiki. It's called Namu Wiki, and you actually have a wiki on Namu Wiki. And
wow.
Yeah, you do. And it's very well put, well organized. So I looked at it and I was like, this is pretty accurate, very interesting. And it says that you value the philosophy of code of law. It says that as he values the code of law. You said it somewhere, I think, and you just mentioned code of law. So speaking of that, recently, many DeFi projects have been, forking like crazy, and it makes it difficult to sometimes abide by the code of law, right? What are your thoughts on this? We're going to move into DeFi soon. So what are your thoughts on this forking of DeFi projects?
Yeah, lex lata, the law as it's written, not as you desire. It's an old Latin principle. So code as law is kind of a rehash of older ideas. And so I tend to be a textualist or an originalist. You look at the Supreme Court of the United States, there's these judicial activists like the Ginsburgs, and then you have your textualists like the Scalias. And there's a very big philosophical debate there. Should you just interpret the law as it's written, regardless of its consequences, and leave it to a different group of people to modify that? Or should you import some sort of temporal and moral layer to it and say the law can be redefined based upon things? The hazard in a decentralized system, when you go from a textualist viewpoint to a consequentialist, activist viewpoint, is that you invite centralization. because it's not an open discussion. You'll end up having only a small group of people who end up deciding where the future is going to go. And the problem is that you have implicit, sometimes explicit social contracts behind things. For example, when you buy a Bitcoin, there's an implicit social contract that there's ever only going to be 21 million Bitcoin. So a violation of that principle would be something like, I'm a core developer of Bitcoin, Mt. Gox just got hacked, I lost all my money, so I'm going to create some new Bitcoin to reimburse myself. We'd all say, well, that's completely wrong. But that's effectively what's happened in some of these DeFi cases, and somewhat what happened when you start refunding money and doing all these other things. You have this idea of how the system's going to operate. That was the term of service. You had people who don't know each other from all around the world, from Mongolia to Argentina, who bought into it. And then suddenly a small group of people got together and they say, hey, you know what? Because we think this is the right idea, we're going to go use the special powers we have to go change that particular system, in some cases to benefit us. Like, for example, with the DAO hack, one of the guiding factors there was that if it did not get reimbursed, there was very likely going to be a law enforcement investigation and a class action lawsuit. And because of the transitivity of the Ethereum founders, it was a really good possibility that the foundation and Vitalik personally would have been dragged into it. Now, you can't imagine that that didn't have a great degree of weight on their decision to do what they did. Because they said, if we don't do this, well, we're going to get sued and criminal stuff and all these things, and it'll destroy the project. So because a small group of people who were intimately connected and had the power to do it and the treasury to do it, they decided for every single user of the system. This is one of the reasons why Ethereum Classic exists, because people didn't believe in that. About 10% of the population thought that that was a bad idea. Now, I can see it from the other perspective. You make mistakes. Bad things happen. Criminals exist. And also, what happens when protocol flaws are so tremendous that it could destroy your whole system? Bitcoin actually ran into this problem. There was a flaw in the Bitcoin scripting system that if a person took advantage of it, would allow you to create as many Bitcoins as you wanted. Technically, the system was written to permit that. So if you were an originalist, a textualist, you'd say, well, that's the way the system is. We just have to accept it. Well, obviously, you go and fix it, right? Because you don't want to destroy the system. Zcash ran into this very same problem. And in fact, the integrity of Zcash is in question even till today because of it. There was a flaw in the implementation and protocol design of their crypto for their snarks. And the result of that was that if a person knew how to exploit it, they could counterfeit Zcash tokens. The problem is, because it happened on the private side of the system, you actually don't know if people used that or not. And it's an open question today. Did a clever hacker create a bunch of Zcash tokens for himself? You actually don't know. There's no way to audit the system. So the entire integrity of the ledger and the monetary policy, because of that cryptographic flaw, is in question. So here's an interesting question. Let's say we discover that a hacker did create some tokens. Would it be okay to take those out of circulation? So this is where code is law gets problematic. And to your point about DeFi, it gets very problematic. So my belief is that you should build a governance system into your cryptocurrency to help you deal with these difficult questions. Because I, as a founder, do not get the right to decide that. My community should decide that through some sort of organized way. So Cardano in particular, we spent over 5 years working on governance stuff, voting systems, how to eschew rational ignorance, privacy into the voting system and so forth, to basically get on-chain governance to a point where we can ask difficult questions. Questions from, should we change the monetary policy? Should we reverse a transaction? Should we prune the ledger? Should we implement a particular protocol to make us immune to something, but it has a trade-off? Maybe it excludes some users or these types of things. There is new regulation that's come out, and that regulation is quite problematic. But if we don't implement it, we will get blacklisted in Korea or in the United States or something like that. Those are all super difficult questions, and frankly, they're above my pay grade. So my feeling is, if you're going to change the law of the system, you need a legislative body to do it. You don't do it with the judicial system. My job is just to interpret it the way it's written. And if you want to change it, we need to get a vote. And if you vote, we can change it as long as it's a fair one and it's has a high degree of participation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, DeFi is such a controversial, I mean, it's very hyped up, but it's also a very controversial field right now. But I think a lot of people are very excited in general, and they were asking, like, a lot of people from the Korean community were asking, when DeFi for Cardano, right? I think
2021. The whole year we're going to be rolling out stuff and apps, and it's going to be a fun year. We're getting the foundation laid this year and early next year, and the whole year will be building stable coins and fixes and oracles and all these things and so forth.
So before we go, if you can say, like, what are some of the Asia community plans, anything that you're planning for the future for Asia, and also some closing remarks.
Sure. Asia's obviously one of the most important places for Cardano. We were born in Japan. 92% of the participants were in Japan. Few in Korea, few in China, but most were in Japan. Since that time, a lot of diversity has occurred, and it is spread out all across the world. But Asia is near and dear to my heart. And I used to live in Japan. I lived in Osaka. So I'd often travel to Seoul. I'd often travel all around Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and so forth. I even went to Vietnam a few times, so that was a fun experience. Learned how to get run over by the mopeds while I was there. We're going to build up the ambassador programs there. We're going to try to make sure that we get a lot of development diversity. And we, of course, would like to partner with great companies like the Sonys and the Samsungs of the world and so forth. And so we have people whose day job is to worry about that. We also like working with Asian governments. In particular, the government of Mongolia has been quite friendly to us, and we've done some great things with them, and we'll continue to do that. Love to do some things in Korea as well. There's a great IoT community there, and I think it'd be a lot of fun to try to drag that into the Cardano space. In terms of closing remarks, go to cardano.org. We tried to build that website to be the opener of your experience, to get you where you need to go and get you the information you need to go. And if you agree with the philosophy of the project, follow us on Twitter, follow us on YouTube, and you'll see that every week we're releasing new videos. Every week we're tweeting out cool things, and it's just amazing to see us grow from such a small community to hundreds of thousands of people. And I hope this time next year we have millions of people, and a lot of them are from Asia.
Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I hope for the best for Cardano and for you for 2020 and 2021. Hope to see you in person very soon.
Absolutely. This has been so much fun. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye.